My child, before this message ends, someone you never imagined will finally understand the value you have always carried. Right now, a smile is growing on your soulmate's face. And almost nobody around them understands why. The reason has nothing to do with coincidence. It has everything to do with something you unknowingly set into motion. Don't leave before the end. Because the first secret is only beginning to unfold. Listen carefully. For what felt like forever, your soulmate had been carrying a quiet emptiness that nobody around them could truly recognize. They laughed when they were expected to laugh, nodded politely during conversations, smiled for photographs, and continued walking through each ordinary day as though everything was perfectly fine. But deep inside, there was a place that never felt complete. It was a silence they learned to hide so well that even the people closest to them believed nothing was wrong. Yet every evening, when the noise of the world faded away, they would find themselves staring into the distance, wondering why their heart continued searching for something it could not explain. They had convinced themselves that life was simply meant to feel this way. They believed perhaps everyone carried an invisible weight, perhaps everyone accepted unfinished stories without asking questions. But what they didn't know was that far away, without realizing it, you had already started changing the direction of their future. Not with grand gestures, not with dramatic promises, but through one simple decision that seemed completely ordinary at the time. That quiet decision began creating invisible ripples neither of you could yet see. Days passed, and strange little moments began appearing in your soulmate's life. They started waking up feeling lighter than usual. Songs they hadn't heard in years suddenly played in unexpected places. Familiar memories no longer brought sadness. Instead, they carried warmth. At first, your soulmate dismissed these moments as meaningless coincidences. But the feeling refused to disappear. One afternoon, while everyone around them continued speaking about ordinary responsibilities and future plans, your soulmate suddenly became quiet. They weren't distracted. They weren't upset. They were listening to something inside themselves that had remained silent for years. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a prediction. It was simply peace. A kind of peace they thought they had lost forever. For the first time in a very long while, they smiled without forcing it. Nobody noticed. Nobody understood. But heaven noticed. And somewhere beyond what human eyes could see, invisible doors quietly began opening. Don't skip. Because this small smile would soon confuse everyone around them. Later that evening, one family member casually asked why they seemed happier lately. Your soulmate hesitated before answering because they honestly didn't know. They couldn't explain it. They couldn't point to one event, one conversation, or one achievement. All they knew was that something heavy had quietly disappeared from their heart. The family member laughed and assumed it was because of work. Someone else guessed it was because of new opportunities. Another believed there must secretly be someone new entering their life. Your soulmate smiled politely. But inside, They knew every guess was wrong. That same night, they opened an old drawer searching for something completely unrelated. Hidden beneath forgotten papers rested a small object they had not touched in years. The moment they picked it up, another memory rushed back with unexpected clarity. It wasn't painful anymore. It felt comforting. Almost as though the memory itself had been waiting for this exact day to return. Without realizing it, your name quietly crossed their thoughts again. Not with sadness. Not with regret. But with hope. Hope they believed had disappeared forever. Meanwhile, somewhere else, your own ordinary routine continued exactly as it always had. You had no idea that your unseen kindness, your quiet patience, and the choices you recently made had already begun reaching places you could never physically travel. Sometimes life changes long before we receive proof that anything has changed at all. That is exactly what was happening now. Your soulmate wasn't smiling because they suddenly found every answer. They were smiling because, for the first time, their heart stopped believing the story was over. That single emotional shift became stronger with every passing hour. The next morning brought another unexpected surprise. Instead of waking with anxiety, they opened their eyes feeling calm. Instead of immediately checking messages or worrying about unfinished responsibilities, they simply sat beside the window watching the sunrise longer than usual. Something about the light felt different. Something about the air felt peaceful. Even the smallest details seemed unusually beautiful. Birds sounded louder. The morning breeze felt softer. Colors appeared brighter. Nothing around them had changed. Yet everything somehow felt new. Don't skip. Because someone was quietly watching this transformation. Across the breakfast table, an older relative carefully observed your soulmate. They had witnessed years of hidden disappointment and silent heartbreak. They knew the difference between a fake smile and a genuine one. This morning was different. For the first time in years, the smile reached their eyes. The relative said nothing. But deep inside, questions began growing. What happened overnight? Who changed their heart? Why did years of sadness suddenly disappear without explanation? Your soulmate couldn't answer because they genuinely didn't know. All they knew was this. For reasons beyond explanation, life no longer felt hopeless. Later that afternoon, while organizing old belongings, another unexpected discovery appeared. Tucked inside an envelope was a forgotten handwritten sentence that immediately captured their attention. The words were simple, yet they carried extraordinary meaning. Some hearts find each other long before the world allows them to meet again. Your soulmate read the sentence once. Then again. Then a third time. A quiet smile returned. Not because they fully understood its meaning, but because somehow, those words felt strangely connected to you. Far away, invisible pieces of a much larger story continued falling perfectly into place. The happiness growing inside your soulmate wasn't random. It wasn't temporary. And it certainly wasn't accidental. Someone greater had already begun arranging moments neither of you expected. Very soon. One unexpected conversation. One forgotten memory. And one shocking revelation would explain exactly why your soulmate suddenly couldn't stop smiling. But before anyone spoke the truth, a message was about to arrive. One message capable of changing absolutely everything. The rest of that afternoon passed quietly, yet nothing inside your soulmate felt ordinary anymore. They tried returning to their normal routine, answering conversations, finishing responsibilities, and smiling politely whenever someone spoke to them, but their thoughts kept drifting back to that strange feeling they could not explain. It was not excitement in the usual sense. It was something much deeper, almost as though their heart had recognized a change long before their mind could understand it. Every few minutes they found themselves pausing for no reason, looking out the window, taking a deeper breath than usual, and wondering why the future suddenly no longer seemed frightening. The weight they had carried for so long was becoming lighter with every passing hour, and although they could not see the reason, they could feel its presence growing stronger. Somewhere, without your knowledge, every act of kindness you had shown, every moment when you chose peace instead of bitterness, every time you refused to let disappointment change your character, had quietly become part of a much larger story. Life has a remarkable way of remembering the things people believe have gone unnoticed. Nothing genuine is ever wasted, and although you had never expected anyone to recognize those quiet moments, they had already begun reaching the one heart that mattered most. Your soulmate felt as though invisible chains were slowly breaking apart. They could not explain why memories that once brought sadness were now bringing comfort instead. Even the mistakes of the past no longer felt like permanent endings. They felt like unfinished chapters waiting for the right moment to be understood. That realization alone brought another smile across their face, one so natural that even they became surprised by it. They caught their own reflection in a nearby mirror and almost laughed because they had forgotten what it felt like to smile without pretending. For years they had practiced convincing everyone around them that they were perfectly fine, but now they realized they had also been trying to convince themselves. Today was different. Today their heart refused to believe the lie that happiness belonged only to other people. Today, for the first time in longer than they could remember, hope felt real. Hope felt close. Hope felt personal. They whispered to themselves that perhaps life had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps every delay had carried a purpose they were never meant to understand until now. The strange peace inside them continued growing stronger, and with every passing minute it became harder to ignore. They had no proof that anything significant was about to happen, yet their spirit behaved as though it already knew something wonderful was coming. That quiet confidence confused them, but it also comforted them. They stopped asking themselves why they felt happier and instead began accepting the feeling with gratitude. That single decision changed everything because when the heart stops fighting peace, peace finally begins revealing its purpose. Don't skip. Because someone else was beginning to notice the change, and this person had been silently waiting for this moment for a very long time. Later that evening, a trusted family member looked carefully at your soulmate during dinner. They had watched them struggle through countless difficult days. They remembered the sleepless nights, the quiet tears nobody else noticed, the forced conversations, and the moments when hope seemed completely gone. They leaned forward and gently asked a simple question. "Why do you look so peaceful today?" The room became unusually quiet. Your soulmate looked down for a moment before smiling again. They wanted to answer honestly, but honesty required an explanation they simply did not have. After several seconds they quietly admitted, "I don't know. I just feel like something good is finally getting closer." The word surprised everyone sitting at the table. No one laughed. No one interrupted. They could hear the certainty in your soulmate's voice. This was not wishful thinking. This was not false optimism. It sounded like someone who had already seen the sunrise even while everyone else still believed it was night. That conversation ended quickly, but its effect remained. Later that night, the same family member quietly walked into another room and remembered something they had promised themselves years earlier. Hidden inside an old storage box was a small envelope that had never been opened. It had been placed there because someone once believed the timing was wrong. They had intended to forget about it forever, but somehow tonight they suddenly remembered exactly where it was. Slowly they removed the envelope and stared at it without opening it. Dust covered the edges. Time had faded the paper. Yet one detail remained perfectly clear. A single handwritten word rested across the front. It wasn't a full name. It wasn't a complete sentence. It was only one word. Future. The family members' hands trembled slightly because they suddenly remembered who had placed the envelope there all those years ago and why they had insisted it should only be opened when the right moment finally arrived. Until now, nobody believed that moment would ever come. Yet after seeing your soulmate smile today, something inside them whispered that perhaps the waiting season had finally ended. They carefully placed the envelope on the table but hesitated before opening it. Memories flooded back one after another. Forgotten conversations. Silent promises. Decisions made out of fear rather than truth. Every memory pointed toward one person. You. They slowly closed their eyes, wondering if it was finally time for hidden truths to come into the light. Outside, the evening sky grew darker, but inside that quiet room, hope had never been brighter. At almost the exact same moment, your soulmate stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. They looked up toward the stars with an unexpected smile and softly whispered words they hadn't spoken in years. If this feeling is real, don't let it disappear. The wind gently moved through the trees as though carrying the prayer somewhere beyond human understanding. What your soulmate didn't know was that answers had already begun moving toward them. Far away, another person had just discovered something that would connect every unanswered question from the past. That discovery would soon begin a chain of events no one could stop. The smile your soulmate wore today was only the beginning. Within hours, someone would gather the courage to reveal a truth they had protected for years. And once those first words were spoken aloud, there would be no turning back. The hidden reason behind your soulmate's happiness would finally begin revealing itself. But the greatest surprise was still waiting just ahead. The evening settled slowly, wrapping everything in a calm silence that felt strangely different from every evening before it. Your soulmate could not explain why their heart continued feeling lighter with every passing hour. Nothing extraordinary had happened on the outside. The same streets, the same conversations, the same responsibilities surrounded them. Yet inside, something beautiful had already begun changing. For the first time in a very long while, they were no longer searching for reasons to smile. The smile simply appeared on its own. Every few moments they caught themselves remembering small details they had forgotten years ago. A familiar laugh. A kind word. A promise that once seemed impossible to keep. None of those memories brought pain anymore. Instead, they carried warmth, and that warmth continued growing stronger. It was almost as if their heart already knew someone had been protecting a truth that was finally ready to come into the light. They stood quietly near the window, watching the evening sky slowly change color. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, and without thinking, they whispered your name so softly that even they barely heard it. The moment those words left their lips, an unexpected feeling of peace settled over them again. They smiled and shook their head, wondering why your name suddenly felt connected to happiness instead of uncertainty. At that exact moment, miles away, someone else was holding an old notebook that had not been opened in years. The pages were worn, the edges had faded with time, but one section had remained perfectly protected. Slowly they turned each page until they reached a folded note hidden carefully between them. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. They unfolded it with trembling hands and began reading. Every sentence uncovered another forgotten piece of the past. Every paragraph revealed sacrifices nobody had ever known existed. It became painfully clear that many of the stories people believed were never completely true. Decisions had been made based on fear instead of facts. People had walked away believing they understood everything when, in reality, they understood almost nothing. The person reading the note sat perfectly still. Several minutes passed before they finally looked up. Tears quietly filled their eyes, not because of sadness alone, but because they realized how unfairly everything had unfolded. They whispered to themselves, "If only we had known this sooner." The room remained silent, yet deep inside they knew the time for silence had finally ended. They carefully folded the note again, placed it inside the notebook, and reached for their phone. Their finger hovered above one familiar contact for several long seconds. They wanted to call immediately, but something told them this conversation deserved to happen face to face. Some truths are simply too important to be spoken through a phone screen. They quietly stood up, took the notebook with them, and left the house without telling anyone where they were going. Meanwhile, your soulmate continued smiling without realizing that someone had just begun a journey that would completely change the direction of both your lives. They believed their happiness had arrived without explanation, but heaven had been arranging this moment long before either of you noticed the first sign. Every delay had carried purpose. Every unanswered question had been leading toward this exact season. Nothing had truly been lost. Nothing had been forgotten. The story had simply been waiting for the right time to continue. Don't skip. Because before this night ended, one unexpected visitor would arrive carrying answers nobody believed still existed. As darkness covered the streets, the person carrying the old notebook finally reached a quiet neighborhood where a single light remained glowing inside one familiar home. They stopped outside the gate for a moment, taking several deep breaths. Memories flooded back one after another. They remembered the day everything changed. They remembered the silence that followed. They remembered promises that were never fulfilled and conversations that ended too soon. Most of all, they remembered one name that had quietly remained inside their heart through every passing year. Your name. Slowly they walked toward the front door and raised their hand to knock. Before they could touch the door, voices from inside reached their ears. One person was saying, "Lately, they haven't stopped smiling. It's like something wonderful is about to happen." Another voice answered softly, "I've noticed the same thing. I've never seen them this peaceful before." Hearing those words made the visitor close their eyes. They realized they were not arriving too late. They were arriving at exactly the right moment. They knocked gently. A few seconds later, the door opened. The surprise on the homeowner's face was impossible to hide. Neither person spoke immediately. Years of unanswered questions stood silently between them. Finally, the visitor held up the notebook and quietly said, "I found something that belongs to all of us." Those simple words changed the atmosphere instantly. They were invited inside without another question. The notebook was placed carefully on the table, but nobody rushed to open it. Sometimes people instinctively understand that a single page can change an entire future. After a long silence, the visitor slowly opened it and turned directly to the hidden note. Everyone sitting in the room leaned closer. The first few lines were read aloud. Within moments, disbelief spread across every face. Each sentence revealed another misunderstanding that had quietly controlled lives for years. The room became completely silent. No one interrupted. No one argued. Every word sounded too honest to deny. By the time half the note had been read, someone sitting in the corner quietly wiped away tears. Another person whispered, "So this is why everything felt incomplete." No one had an answer because the truth itself had become the answer. At that exact same moment, your soulmate looked up at the night sky from miles away and smiled once again without any reason they could explain. Their hearts somehow sensed that invisible walls were finally beginning to fall. The happiness inside them continued growing stronger, unaware that only a few miles away, people were finally discovering the real story behind everything. Before sunrise, one decision would be made. And once that decision was spoken aloud, there would be no turning back. The smile on your soulmate's face was about to become even brighter. Because someone had finally decided that your name would never be hidden again. The room remained completely silent after the final line of the note was read aloud. No one reached for another page. No one tried to interrupt the silence. It was the kind of silence that only appears when people suddenly realize that everything they believed for years had been built upon incomplete truths. The visitor carefully folded the paper again and placed it back inside the notebook, allowing everyone a few quiet moments to process what they had just heard. One family member slowly leaned back in their chair, staring at the ceiling as though replaying every important memory from the past. Another quietly covered their face with both hands, remembering conversations they wished they could take back. Regret has a way of arriving all at once, and tonight it entered that room without asking permission. Finally, one voice broke the silence. If this is all true, then we've misunderstood the most important person from the very beginning. No one disagreed. For the first time, every person sitting there reached the exact same conclusion without needing to argue. The truth had spoken for itself. Meanwhile, your soulmate had no idea this conversation was taking place. They had gone for a slow evening walk, smiling every time a cool breeze brushed across their face. The strange happiness inside them continued growing stronger, almost as though their heart was quietly celebrating something before their mind had even been informed. They paused beside a small park where children were laughing together, and for reasons they could not explain, they felt hopeful instead of lonely. That alone surprised them. For years, moments like these reminded them of everything they believed they had lost. Tonight they inspired something completely different. They inspired expectation. They whispered softly, "Why does it feel like tomorrow is going to change everything?" They laughed at themselves after saying it aloud, unaware that those words were closer to reality than they could possibly imagine. At the very same time, inside the house where the notebook had been opened, another discovery quietly appeared. As the visitor prepared to close the notebook, a small folded photograph slipped from between two pages and landed gently on the floor. Everyone instinctively looked down. The visitor slowly picked it up, turned it over, and immediately froze. Written across the back in faded handwriting were just a few simple words. One day they will finally understand. The date underneath those words was far older than anyone expected. That single sentence sent another wave of emotion through the room. Whoever had written it had believed, even years ago, that the complete truth would eventually come to light. They had simply never lived long enough to witness it themselves. One older relative quietly whispered, "We owe them the ending they were waiting for." The visitor nodded without hesitation. "Then we stop hiding. Starting tonight. Don't skip." Because the very first person they decided to call was someone your soulmate never expected to hear from again. A phone rested silently on the table as everyone discussed what should happen next. Some believed the truth should be revealed carefully. Others insisted there was no reason to wait another day. After years of confusion, every additional hour felt unnecessary. Finally, the oldest member of the family spoke with calm certainty. "No more delays. Too much time has already been lost." Those words settled every disagreement immediately. The visitor picked up the phone, searched through old contacts, and stopped at one familiar name. For several seconds they simply stared at the screen, remembering the last conversation they had shared years before. It had ended with silence instead of understanding. Tonight would be different. They pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Then twice. Then 3 times. Nobody in the room spoke. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the ringing itself. Finally, the call connected. A quiet voice answered from the other side. The visitor closed their eyes before speaking. "There's something you deserve to know. We've discovered the truth. And it changes everything." The person listening became completely silent. The visitor continued explaining only enough to arrange a meeting for the following morning. Nothing more. Some conversations should never happen over the phone. As the call ended, everyone in the room understood that there was no turning back now. By sunrise, pieces that had remained separated for years would begin fitting together again. Across town, your soulmates suddenly felt their phone vibrate. It wasn't the call from the family. It was a simple notification that carried no important information at all. Yet when they unlocked the screen, they paused. The wallpaper displayed an old sunrise photograph they had almost forgotten about. Looking at it brought another peaceful smile. They whispered, "It feels like a new beginning." They placed the phone back into their pocket and continued walking beneath the stars, never realizing that several people had just spent the evening discussing how to finally make that new beginning possible. Back inside the quiet house, the notebook was carefully wrapped and placed into a small protective box. No one wanted another page to disappear. No one wanted another truth to remain hidden. Before everyone left, the oldest relative looked around the room and spoke one final sentence. "Tomorrow, nobody speaks with anger. Nobody speaks with blame. We only speak with honesty." Every person agreed. Outside, the first cool wind before dawn moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the feeling that a long season of waiting was finally coming to an end. Your soulmate looked toward the horizon one last time before heading home, smiling without knowing why. But by this time tomorrow, they would finally discover why that smile had refused to leave their face for days. And hidden among the truths waiting to be revealed was one final message connected to you that no one in that room had opened yet. It remained sealed inside the box, waiting for the exact moment when every heart was finally ready to hear what it had to say. The first light of morning slowly stretched across the horizon, and for reasons your soulmate still could not explain, they woke before the alarm had a chance to ring. There was no heaviness in their chest, no lingering sadness waiting beside the bed like it had so many mornings before. Instead, there was an unfamiliar excitement quietly resting inside their heart. They sat on the edge of the bed for several minutes, smiling without realizing it, almost as though their spirit had already heard news their mind had not yet received. The house was still silent. Outside, the world looked ordinary. Birds moved between the trees, the wind carried the scent of a new day, and sunlight slowly filled the room. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every small detail seemed to whisper that something important was drawing closer. They stood by the window and took a long, peaceful breath before softly saying to themselves, "Whatever is coming, I think I'm finally ready." Those words surprised even them. For so long they had feared unexpected changes because change had always brought disappointment. Today was different. Today, hope felt stronger than fear. Meanwhile, across town, the people who had gathered around the old notebook the previous evening had barely slept. Each of them kept replaying the words they had read, realizing how many years had quietly disappeared because no one had known the complete story. The sealed message remained untouched inside the protective box, resting in the center of the table as though waiting for permission to speak. More than once, someone suggested opening it immediately. Each time, the oldest relative gently shook their head. "Not yet," they said. Some truths are not only about what they say. They are also about when they are heard. Everyone respected those words. Deep inside, they knew the timing mattered. The morning meeting had already been arranged. Before another sunset arrived, several people who had spent years carrying different versions of the same story would finally sit together and hear the truth from beginning to end. The visitor carefully lifted the box, holding it with both hands as though protecting something priceless. They looked around the room and quietly reminded everyone, today isn't about proving who was right. It's about healing what should never have been broken. Those simple words changed the atmosphere immediately. Anger faded. Pride disappeared. For the first time in years, every person present shared exactly the same goal. Not victory. Not blame. Only honesty. At that exact moment, your soulmate stepped outside, unaware that every road seemed to be leading toward the same destination. They smiled at a stranger passing by. They greeted an elderly neighbor with unusual warmth. Even people who barely knew them noticed something different. One neighbor laughed and asked, "You look happier than you've looked in years. What's your secret?" Your soulmate smiled and shrugged. I wish I knew. They laughed together, but after walking away, your soulmate quietly whispered, maybe happiness sometimes arrives before the reason does. Those words lingered in the morning air, almost as though the world itself agreed. Far away, you continued living your own ordinary day, never imagining that your unseen influence had become the center of conversations taking place in another home. You had no idea your name had already been spoken with respect instead of misunderstanding. You had no idea that hearts once filled with doubt were now filled with regret. Every quiet choice you had made to remain patient, every moment you chose kindness over bitterness, had slowly become undeniable evidence that the old story had never been complete. Without realizing it, you had changed people simply by remaining true to who you were. Don't skip. Because before the morning ended, the sealed message would finally be placed in front of the one person who had waited the longest to understand the truth. Just before noon, everyone gathered exactly where they had agreed. The room felt peaceful, but every heartbeat carried quiet anticipation. No one wasted time with ordinary conversation. They understood why they were there. The visitor carefully placed the protective box in the center of the table and slowly opened it. Inside rested the same sealed envelope that no one had dared to touch the previous night. Time had slightly faded its color, but the seal remained perfectly intact. Every pair of eyes focused on it. For several long moments, nobody moved. Finally, the oldest relative reached forward with calm hands, gently broke the seal, and unfolded the paper inside. Before reading a single word, they closed their eyes for a brief moment, almost as though silently honoring the person who had written it years before. Then they began reading aloud. The message did not accuse anyone. It did not demand justice. Instead, it spoke about patience, forgiveness, and the remarkable way truth eventually finds its own voice, no matter how deeply it has been hidden. It explained that misunderstandings can separate people for a season, but genuine love, respect, and honesty have a way of surviving even the longest silence. Then came one sentence that left the entire room speechless. If you are reading this, it means the smile has finally returned. And when that smile returns, you will know it is safe to bring the truth into the light. No one spoke. Several people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. They suddenly understood why your soulmate had been smiling without explanation. The message had predicted this moment years before. It had anticipated that peace would arrive first, and answers would follow afterward. That realization filled the room with awe. The visitor slowly folded the paper again, but before placing it back inside the envelope, something small slipped onto the table. It was a tiny photograph no one had noticed before. On the back, written in careful handwriting, were just 6 unforgettable words: never stop believing in what is real. The room fell silent once more. The oldest relative looked around and quietly said, "There is only one thing left to do." Everyone nodded because they already knew what those words meant. The time had finally come to tell your soulmate everything. But none of them realized that while they were preparing to reveal the truth, your soulmate had just received an unexpected invitation that would bring them face to face with the very people holding those long-hidden answers. The smile they had carried for days was about to meet the reason it had appeared in the first place. And the first word spoken when they walked through that door would leave everyone completely speechless. The afternoon sun slowly drifted lower as your soulmate followed the directions written in the unexpected invitation. Every step felt strangely familiar, even though they had not visited that place in years. Their heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from quiet anticipation. It was the same peaceful feeling that had been growing inside them for days, only now it was stronger than ever. They paused outside the entrance for a brief moment, taking a deep breath before gently opening the door. The room immediately became silent. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward them. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. It was a silence filled with emotion rather than uncertainty. Your soulmate looked around the room with quiet confusion, wondering why everyone seemed overwhelmed just by seeing them. Then they noticed the familiar notebook resting on the table beside the carefully folded envelope. Something deep inside their heart whispered that this meeting had been waiting for years. The oldest relative slowly stood and walked toward them with tears already forming in their eyes. Without saying another word, they gently embraced your soulmate. It was not an embrace filled with pity. It was one filled with apology, understanding, and relief. After a long moment they stepped back and quietly said, "We've been waiting to tell you something we should have told you a long time ago." Your soulmate remained completely still. They could feel that this conversation would change everything. Everyone returned to their seats, and the notebook was opened one final time. Every important page was read carefully from beginning to end. Every misunderstanding was explained. Every missing detail was finally placed back into its proper place. There was no blame, no anger, only honesty. With every passing minute, your soulmate realized that so many painful years had been shaped by incomplete information rather than truth. The questions that had haunted them for so long finally began receiving gentle, believable answers. Tears slowly filled their eyes, but these were not tears of heartbreak. They were tears of release. It felt as though a burden they had carried for years was quietly lifting away. Then the oldest relative carefully placed the final sealed message into your soulmate's hands and softly said, "This part was always meant for you." With trembling fingers, they unfolded the paper and began reading. Every line seemed to speak directly to their heart. It reminded them that genuine love never disappears simply because circumstances become difficult. It reminded them that patience is often preparing people for a future they cannot yet imagine. It reminded them that the people who remain kind despite disappointment are often protecting blessings they cannot yet see. Then came the final sentence. When you smile again without knowing why, you are already standing at the doorway of your next beginning. Your soulmate slowly lowered the paper and smiled through their tears. For the first time, they finally understood why happiness had appeared before answers. Their heart had recognized hope before their mind recognized the reason. Don't skip. Because the greatest surprise was never the notebook, the message, or the forgotten truth. The greatest surprise was what happened next. The oldest relative quietly looked around the room before speaking once more. There is one final truth we haven't shared. Everyone became silent again. The peace you've been feeling. The smile that refused to leave. It began because someone chose kindness when they had every reason to choose bitterness. Someone continued moving forward without trying to hurt anyone. Someone unknowingly changed hearts simply by remaining true to who they were. Your soulmate already knew who that person was before the name was spoken. A warm smile slowly spread across their face. They closed their eyes for a brief moment, silently grateful for every lesson, every delay, every unexpected turn that had brought this day into existence. They no longer wished to rewrite the past because they finally understood that every chapter had prepared them to recognize the value of truth when it finally arrived. The room, once filled with unanswered questions, was now filled with quiet peace. Conversations became lighter. Laughter slowly returned. People who had avoided one another for years began speaking again with sincerity instead of suspicion. Broken relationships started healing one conversation at a time. Outside, the evening sky glowed with the colors of another beautiful sunset, reminding everyone that every ending quietly makes room for a new beginning. As your soulmate stepped outside, they looked toward the horizon with the same smile that had mysteriously appeared days earlier. Only now they understood it completely. It had never been random. It had never been an accident. Their heart had sensed that hope was finally returning before the world revealed why. Somewhere, without either of you realizing it, goodness had been working patiently behind the scenes all along. Every quiet act of compassion, every moment of patience, every choice to remain genuine had become part of a story far greater than anyone could see. And that is why your soulmate couldn't stop smiling. Not because everything in life had suddenly become perfect, but because they finally discovered that the truth had never stopped moving toward them. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive quietly. Sometimes the biggest miracles begin with nothing more than an unexplained smile. And sometimes the happiest chapter of all begins long before anyone realizes the story has finally changed.